So this video is to help you stuff and sew up Senka the Woolly Mammoth, along with putting on a few extra touches as well, like tips on curving the tusks. So first, when it comes to stuffing, nothing different to a standard Ed's animal. It's just the loops are an extra challenge when it comes to sewing up. So hopefully you'll pick up some tips along the way. So first, stuff the all the legs, making sure that the stuffing is just in the bottom, not in the whole of the leg. So it just goes into that section at the bottom, the rounded section. Use your hook, so put your stuffing in place. Use your hook to push that in with the handle, like that. I'm using a high loft recycled polyester stuffing here. You can obviously use any stuffing that you want to. Just be aware that different types of material of stuffing are fit for different purposes, really. If you want to wash it, then often going for a polyester is the best route. But if it's just ornamental and it's just going to sit on a shelf, you've obviously got lots of other stuffings of totally natural ones as well. You could go for a pure wool or even go for a kapok or a cotton stuffing. So then when it comes to the body, the important thing with this design really is I would strongly recommend using a centralizer to mark the centre of your tummy. That's just because it is so hard to see the shaping once you've got these dark loops all over the body. So make sure that you add your centralizer in as you're going along crocheting, whether that's something like this or just a contrast piece of yarn, because that way it will be much easier to spot where the centre of your body is when it comes to sewing up. And that's something that I'll probably refer to quite a lot in this video, is coming back to that central point. So put your stuffing into your body, then the same into the head. That's my tracking stitch marker, so I'm just going to remove that as I go along. Same into the head. Now, some of you might opt to stuff this before you then decrease for the trunk if you want to, but just to show you, it is perfectly possible to do the whole piece and then add the stuffing at the end. It really is personal preference on whether you like to stuff as you go along or do it all at the end. And keeping that stuffing in one big piece like I just did then, that gives you the best effect rather than rolling it into small balls and then trying to push it through. Keep the stuffing in one big piece and try and push it in like I just did there with the heel end of your hook. So that's that one. Last one is to put a little bit of stuffing into these tusks. And remember that when you're stuffing something like this, that obviously is small and narrow, goes down to not many stitches, rather than just pushing with your heel end of your hook, you can also put the end in like that and just tease that down so it goes right the way into the end of the tusk like that. Now they are curved, but I am going to do a technique to curve them even more so that they stay put in a really curved shape as well. Right, time to sew up. So I'm going to use a wool needle. And when I've crocheted all these parts, what I've been careful to do is to actually leave a long length of yarn on each part so that I don't have to rejoin afterwards. If it's too late and you've already crocheted them with short ends on, all you'll need to do is rejoin yourself a length of yarn in that colour so that you can sew the pieces together. So first, I'm just going to sew the trunk flat. So that is the top of my head. So all I'm going to do is fold my trunk flat and just sew across those stitches like that. And then in and through and round a stitch. And you can see on this trunk the lovely texture that's created by just doing the back loop only. Right, then take your body and first make sure your stuffing's inside, and we're going to gather the stitches on the body. So where you've got your remaining stitches at the top, and I guess this is the first challenge of sewing up a loopy one, is all these loops like to get in the way and be in the wrong place. So before you do it, just have a look, make sure you pull any of those loops out that have snuck in during you pushing that stuffing in. There's another one there. There we go. And then just do a running stitch around the last stitches of that round. to gather them together. Now, with your centralizer very much front and centre and facing you, you want to line your head up so that the trunk is going down directly onto that centralizer point like that. Then flip your head backwards. And where I'm going to sew is actually where the loop stitches stop. So I'm going to sew directly up into where those loop stitches stop like that. And what I'll do is just do a few stitches to begin with to secure it in and check that I'm in the right position. So again, bring that back, check that you've got your trunk lined up with your centralizer point, and then secure it in place. And my tip really would be when you're sewing up a loop stitch one like this is hold those loop stitches down with the thumb on your non-sewing hand, so your hand that doesn't have the wool needle in. And that way you should get a clearer view to be able to put those stitches in between one piece and the other. So that's the front of the head like that. Then I'm going to flip round, I'm going to do the back. So obviously here I've got loop stitches on both sides. So what I'll do before I do any stitches is try and divide them up with a parting running down there like that. So hold them in the different directions and then sew between the two pieces. Pulling the loops out as you go if any have got caught up. So that's 4 stitches into the back. Then once again, I'll just make sure that that's lining up with the front. Before then, I'll just do a couple on either side to make sure it's really strong between the two pieces. So part them again. And I love this design. It is an old one that I did a very long time ago. And all I've done is revisited it to put a few extra touches on really, just to finish it off even more. But I hope you enjoy making it. It's really, I really enjoy this one. And I know that my children absolutely love it. So head and body attached, 4 legs. The legs are all exactly the same. So sew the top close before we sew these into position. Like that. And then again, part the loops. So get into your joint between your head and your body like that. Part the loops so you've got a clear view of where you're going to put it. And like I always do with the limbs, I'm going to sew the whole of one side first, then flip it and do the other side. And just make sure really when you're sewing and you've got all these loops involved to almost tease the loops out if you do catch any in. So do you see how there, when I was pulling that tight, a loop might pull itself in. Just tease the loop out so that you know you've got those stitches nice and tight between the two pieces. So flip it over, part your loops again. And this would apply not just to the woolly mammoth. This would also be one like Blake the orangutan that's got loop stitches all over its body, Nusha the Persian cat, Lauren the Angora rabbit, Samson the Old English sheepdog, or even down to the Newfoundland and quite a few of the dog breeds that might have loops all over their bodies as well. So don't think that it is just specific to this. These loop stitches all over. It's a great video to watch if you are doing anything that has lots of loop stitches when you are sewing up. So with one in, I'm going to come and do exactly the same thing on the other side. And when I'm securing off an end, all I'm doing is heading into an area where I've not got loops, because the thing is when you do a loop stitch one like this, it's not that you're working them into every stitch. So you see I've got a whole patch there that hasn't got any loops in. I'll just go in and around a stitch to secure that end off. What can be quite handy as a tip is I would snip off your ends as you go along, just because it's very easy to lose one in amongst the loops. So as you're going, probably makes sense to tidy it up as you go, so you've got a nice clear view without those extra ends. Right, so the two top legs are in. It's now time for the bottom legs. And this is probably the trickiest bit to sew on when you have got these loop stitches. But if we continue doing that parting like we've done with the others, then it's not impossible by any means. It's just a bit more slow than a standard animal. So close it off in exactly the same way as the other legs. Right, then turn it upwards, and again, bear that centralizer point in mind. So you've got your centralizer point coming down the middle, forming a straight line there. Then what we want to do is divide the bottom circle that's under there into thirds. So that's your straight line centralizer point. Here's the third mark, here's the third mark. And what we want to do is sew the legs onto those lines that create the thirds. So do you see how I've parted that nicely there like that? That then means I can position my leg in like that and then sew it into place. Now, woolly mammoth is obviously a very big animal, has a very wide gait, so I wouldn't worry about getting them too close to the central circle. I've got them on the third round out there, just to give you a guide. So hold that leg onto that line that draws a third. Sew along one side. Then the same for the final leg. So you got your straight line coming down the front, split it into thirds, create a parting like I did on the other side. So you've got a nice clear patch to sew into, and then sew your leg into position. Bearing in mind, you want it to be about the same distance as from the circle as that first one was. So I'm going to go there. Right, so legs in place. Now it's time for two ears, and the ears are really diddy, really. All you need to do with those is gather the stitches in at the end and then position them in. So separate the loops in the same way till you've got a nice bold patch to sew them on. Then do the same thing on the other side, so clear a nice hole. Come back to the front and just make sure that they're balanced at about the same height. Right, so that's the ears in place. Now it's time for the tusks. So obviously the thing that really makes it a woolly mammoth. Snip off my ends. You can remove your centralizer point now. And it's time to position our tusks. So with your tusks, what you want to do is sew in the end by just gathering those last few stitches like that. Obviously your stuffing's in from before, but what we want to do is sew it in the direction of it, the way that it curves within the shaping. Now we are going to add a little trick of slip stitches to make it curve even more, but we still want to sew it in the direction of the curve. So you'll find once you've stuffed it, your decreases, all being on one side, have caused it to curve in one direction. And then what you want to do is you just want to sew it just underneath the trunk like that. So hold it into place. You can pin it if you find it easier. So I know some people would find it easier to say put a few blocking pins in to hold that in place before you sew it. And the way that I'm sewing is I'm actually back stitching round so that I keep my cream stitches within my cream. Although we are actually now going to put a few trebles around the edge just to sink it in a little bit more. So it just has a nicer effect, like it's organically growing from the mammoth's head a little bit more. So I'll show you what I mean in a second. That's one of the updates that I've just added into the pattern. Right, so tusk one in place. Like that. Now, because I've got this long end, what I'm actually going to do is leave them on for now, and I will actually use those to do the slip stitches. If you haven't got such a long end, you'll probably have to rejoin. There's no real advantage, it just saves me on sewing up. So I'm going to leave them on for now because I'll use those to actually do the slip stitch technique that curves them. So secure off that end. Then use the lines that you've got naturally on your crochet, especially with when you've got the texture like this. Do you see how you've got those lines coming right the way across? Use the lines to make sure it's in the same position. Hold it in place and then sew it in. So attach that one into place. Right, now when it comes to the slip stitching, so what I said about my ends is the fact that I've actually got this end handily already here. So all I'm going to do is use this to create a curve. So there's my tusk in position like that. And all I'm going to do is a little line of slip stitches across here, which will pull that curve up even more. So you could make them as curved or as non-curved as you want to be. Put your hook in, and all you need to do is move along the tusk like that, pulling that slip stitch nice and tight as you go. Now you could use this on any of the sheep's horns or anything that you feel you'd like to put a little bit more curve in. Is just use this top surface technique that basically puts lots of nice tight slip stitches in like that. I'm going to go a little bit further so it curves right the way around to the end. So you just put yourself a line of slip stitches in like that, and you see how it transforms that tusk from this, where it has got some of the shaping curve, but nothing as extreme as that. And that is now fixed in position. It's obviously nearly invisible. You can obviously see the line of slip stitches, but it being in the same colour means it's nearly invisible, and it will just always hold that tusk in that lovely upright position. So I've sewn in that end. My other end was already in anyway because I used the end that was already there. So I'll now do the same thing on this side. So I'm going to take my longest end like that. So now we've got two tusks curving upwards. So then the finishing touch is really to create the little sockets that these tusks will now sit in, because getting a neat finish on sewing the chestnut onto the cream is a bit of a knack when you're attaching things on like that. So all I'm going to do is do a little round of trebles all the way around the outside to just disguise that. So slip stitch into place and then chain two. And then all we're going to do is treble round the outside. So a treble, you yarn round your hook, go in your fabric, yarn over, and then do 1 and 2. So yarn round your hook in the fabric, and it's just creating a little circle of treble stitches that sit right the way around the outside of that tusk. And I find this easier to do afterwards. I mean, in theory, you could draw yourself a little circle, then try and sew the tusks inside that. I think that will actually be a bit harder. To say that it's not many stitches, I think it's worth doing it as I am here, where you add it on afterwards. So as you can see, all it's done is added a little circle of stitches around the base of that tusk like that. Then all I would do would be to sew in those ends, and actually to strengthen the tusks, I'm going to sew through like that, remaining within that colour. And then I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. So the final thing to add, there's the tail and then there's the eyes. So let's just do the tail. So the tail is a classic chain tail technique, like many of the Ed's animals, the elephant, the hippo, lots of the cows, one that I use a lot. So all you're going to do is fold your yarn to have 4 strands at once. So I've taken my double knit yarn, I'm folding it up like that. Then I put it in my position of my tail. And when you're doing a loop stitch one, don't rush. Put your hook in like that. And then I'd recommend sitting it down and just checking that that feels right. I think I might be slightly over to one side there because obviously it is quite hard to see when you've got your loop stitches in. Sit it down and just check that you're in the right position. Then yarn over. And then holding all 4 strands together, do your chain. And to avoid having to do much sewing up, what I would now do is I would put my hook in through that last loop, and then you're going to work your smaller chains with the single strand on the end. Then that would leave you with one end. You might have more ends if you didn't quite time it right. So don't worry if you've got more ends, you just finish them off in exactly the same way. Is sew back down that tail to secure it off. And into the body, and doing it that way means it's really firmly attached. You're not sewing anything on, so even if your woolly mammoth's going to get carried round by his tail by a little hand, there's no chance that tail can ever come off. It's really firmly attached. So that's in. Right, last thing then is the 2 black threads for the eyes. Use your grid as a guide in the same way that we did on other pieces to get it as symmetrical as possible. Then snip off your ends and any bits of stuffing that have come through, so you've got nice clean eyes, and that is Senka the Woolly Mammoth, totally complete. Now, I have decided not to cut the loops this time round, so I've not cut all of these loops. I've left this loop texture with them as loops. That really is personal preference. If you wanted a really fluffy woolly mammoth, you could now decide to snip all of those loops and even brush them if you wanted to, and it would look absolutely magnificent. But I've decided that actually I really like the texture as loops, so I'm going to be keeping Senka with uncut loops from now on, but you could always opt to just cut them straight away like that, and you'll get a different finish, a much fluffier, messier finish to your woolly mammoth.